The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge. Emma May stood at the window of the general store, her 19-year-old hands pressed against the cold glass, watching as the preacher walked toward the saloon. Her wedding dress hung behind her like a ghost, white cotton that felt more like a burial shroud. "Time to go, girl," came the gruff voice of Mr. Hutchins, the store owner who'd raised her since her pa died. His weathered hands shook as he counted the gold coins one more time. $40. That's what old Samuel Morrison had paid for her. Hand in marriage. Emma May's reflection stared back at her. Pale blue eyes that had seen too much sorrow for 19 years. Auburn hair braided tight like her mama used to do. "I ain't ready," she whispered. "Ready or not, child. Morrison's waiting at the church. Man's been patient long enough." Through the window she saw him, Samuel Morrison, 63 years old with a scraggly gray beard and hands that had buried 2 wives already. He sat on his horse like a king surveying his kingdom, tobacco juice dripping from his chin. But then another figure caught her eye. A tall cowboy sat quiet on a black mare across the street, hat pulled low, watching. She'd seen him before. He'd been coming to town every Sunday for the past month, never causing trouble, never saying much to anybody, just watching. Their eyes met through the glass, and something passed between them, a understanding that words couldn't carry. The cowboy touched the brim of his hat so slight she almost missed it. "Emma May." Hutchins grabbed her arm. "Morrison's getting impatient." She looked back toward the street, but the mysterious cowboy was gone. Only dust swirled where his horse had stood. "I'm coming," she said, but her heart whispered something different. Deep down she felt like this wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. Before we ride deeper into this tale, tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more Wild West stories that'll keep you on the edge of your saddle. Jake Sullivan had been awake since before dawn, same as every day for the past 15 years. His boots hit the wooden floor of his small cabin with the same steady rhythm. Left, right, as he walked to the window and looked out at the rolling hills of his modest ranch. At 35, Jake was a man carved by the frontier. His hands bore scars from rope burns and cattle brands, his face weathered by sun and wind. He stood 6 feet tall, broad shoulders that had carried more weight than just hay bales and saddles. His dark hair showed the first threads of gray, and his green eyes held stories he never told. The morning routine never changed. Feed the horses first. His black mare Midnight and the old chestnut gelding he called Copper. Check the fence line that always seemed to need mending. Milk the cow that provided more company than sustenance. Then coffee, black and strong, while he watched the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Most folks in Cedar Ridge knew Jake as the quiet one. He'd nod politely when he came to town for supplies, pay his bills without argument, and never stayed long enough for conversation. What they didn't know was that Jake Sullivan had once been different. 15 years ago. The memory hit him like it did every morning. Jake at 20, cocky and full of dreams, riding with his older brother Thomas toward California gold country. They'd been partners in everything, cattle drives, poker games, and planning a future that seemed bright as that California sunshine. "We're gonna be rich, little brother," Thomas had said, laughing as his horse kicked up dust on the trail. "Rich enough to buy our own spread, find ourselves pretty wives, raise a mess of kids." Jake touched the silver cross that hung around his neck, the only thing left of Thomas after the Apache raid that took his brother and left Jake with a bullet scar across his ribs and a silence that had grown deeper with each passing year. He'd come to Cedar Ridge not for gold, but for quiet. Bought this small ranch with the money he'd saved from cattle drives, built the cabin with his own hands, and learned to live with the echoes of laughter that would never come again. The loneliness sat on Jake's shoulders like an old coat, familiar, worn, but still heavy. He'd tried courting once or twice over the years. There was Mary Beth from the church social, and later Widow Johnson who baked pies and smiled too much. But each time when they got close enough to matter, Jake would remember Thomas and the dreams they'd shared, and he'd pull back into himself like a turtle into its shell. Now, as he saddled Midnight for the ride into town, Jake felt that familiar ache in his chest. Not just the loneliness anymore, but something else. Something that had started a month ago when he'd first seen the girl in the general store window, Emma May. He didn't even know her full name, but he'd seen the sadness in her blue eyes, recognized it like looking in a mirror. She was trapped, same as he was, just in a different kind of prison. Jake had heard the talk in town. Old Morrison bragging about his new young bride, Hutchins counting gold coins like he'd sold cattle instead of a girl's future. It made Jake's jaw clench and his hands curl into fists. "Ain't none of your business, Sullivan," he told himself, same as he had every Sunday for the past month. But his business or not, he kept riding to town, kept watching, kept feeling something stir in his chest that had been dead since Thomas died. Today felt different, though. Today, when he'd seen Emma May in that wedding dress, looking more like a sacrifice than a bride, something inside Jake had finally awakened. He urged midnight into a gentle lope toward town, the morning sun warming his back. For the first time, in 15 years, Jake Sullivan was about to break his silence. The church bell of Cedar Ridge had never sounded so much like a death toll. Emma May sat in the front pew, her white dress spread around her like spilled milk, while Samuel Morrison stood at the altar adjusting his string tie for the third time. "Where's that preacher?" Morrison grumbled, his voice carrying the authority of a man who owned half the county. "I got cattle to tend to." Emma May's hands trembled in her lap. Behind her, she could hear the whispers of the townsfolk who'd come to witness what everyone knew was more business transaction than holy matrimony. "Poor child," whispered Mrs. Henderson from the mercantile. "Morrison's got money, though," came the reply. "She'll be fed and housed." "Fed and housed ain't the same as loved," Mrs. Henderson shot back. At the back of the church, Hutchins paced like a man with guilt eating at his insides. He'd raised Emma May since she was 7, after her pa died in a mining accident, and her ma took sick and followed him 6 months later. For 12 years, she'd been the daughter he never had, helping in the store, bringing him coffee, reading to him from the newspaper when his eyes got tired. But times had been hard. The store was failing, debts piling up like winter snow, and Morrison had made an offer that could solve everything. $40 in Emma May's hand in marriage. Hutchins told himself it was practical, that she'd be better off with a wealthy rancher than starving with him. The truth sat heavier in his chest than he'd expected. "Mr. Hutchins." Emma May's voice was soft as morning mist. Could I have just one more minute?" Before he could answer, the church doors swung open with a bang that made everyone turn. Preacher Williams stumbled in, his black coat dusty and his face flushed. Sorry, he wheezed. "Had to tend to old Mrs. Cooper. Her time's come and she wanted last rites." Morrison's face darkened. "Preacher, I'm paying you for a wedding, not a funeral story." "Of course, Mr. Morrison. Let's get this done." Emma May felt the walls closing in. In minutes, she'd be Mrs. Samuel Morrison, living in his big house 20 miles from town, cooking his meals, tending his needs, sharing his bed. The thought made her stomach turn. "Stand up, girl," Morrison commanded, and Emma May's legs moved without her permission. But as she rose, the church doors opened again. This time, no bang, just a quiet creak that somehow commanded more attention than Morrison's. Grumbling, Jake Sullivan stepped inside, hat in his hands, green eyes steady and calm. He walked halfway down the aisle and stopped, his boots echoing in the sudden silence. "Preacher," Jake said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd made his decision. "Before you start them vows, I got something to say." Morrison spun around, his face red as a sunset. "What the hell you think you're doing, Sullivan?" "Speak my piece is all." Jake's eyes found Emma May's, and she saw something there she'd never seen in any man's face before. Respect. "Miss Emma May, I'm wondering if this is what you truly want." The church erupted. Morrison shouted about property and contracts. Hutchins stammered about debts and practicality. The townspeople buzzed like angry bees, but Emma May heard none of it. She looked at this quiet cowboy who'd been watching over her from a distance, who'd ridden into her darkest moment like something from a storybook, and for the first time in months, she found her voice. "No," she whispered. "What?" Morrison's voice boomed. "No," she said louder, standing straighter. "This ain't what I want." Morrison's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging in like claws. You don't get to want, girl. You're bought and paid for. That's when Jake Sullivan moved. He crossed the remaining distance between them in 3 long strides, his hand closing over Morrison's wrist with the strength of a man who'd wrestled steers and broken horses. Let her go, Jake said, his voice quiet as winter snow but twice as cold. You got no right. I got the right. Any decent man's gotta stop this. Jake's grip tightened until Morrison winced and let go of Emma May's wrist. Ain't no woman should be sold like cattle. Hutchins stepped forward, his face pale. Jake, you don't understand. I owe money. I understand plenty. Jake reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch heavy with coins. How much? $40, but Jake counted out the money and placed it in Hutchins' shaking hands. There's your $40. Now Emma May ain't bought by nobody. Morrison's face went from red to purple. You can't do this. I got papers. You got papers saying you bought her from him. Jake nodded toward Hutchins. But last I checked, this was America, and American women ain't for sale. Emma May stared at this man who'd just changed her life with $40 and more courage than she'd seen in all her 19 years. Why? She whispered. Jake looked at her with those green eyes that held 15 years of loneliness and loss, and for the first time since his brother died, he smiled. Because everybody deserves to choose their own path, Miss Emma May. Everybody. The silence in the church stretched like a held breath, broken only by Morrison's angry muttering, and the sound of Emma May's heart beating so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. That evening, as the sun painted Cedar Ridge in shades of gold and crimson, Jake sat on the porch of his cabin with Emma May beside him. She'd changed out of her wedding dress into a simple blue cotton dress borrowed from Mrs. Henderson, and her auburn hair fell loose around her shoulders. You didn't have to do that, she said for the 3rd time since they'd left town. Yes, I did. Jake stared out at the rolling hills, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Some things a man can't walk away from. Emma May studied his profile, the strong jaw, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years under the sun, the way he held himself like a man carrying invisible weight. Tell me about him, she said softly. Jake's head turned toward her, surprised. Him? Your brother. You got that look men get when they're remembering someone who ain't coming back. For a long moment, Jake said nothing. The evening breeze stirred the grass, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. Finally, he reached up and pulled the silver cross from beneath his shirt. Thomas gave me this on my 18th birthday, he said, his voice rough as gravel. Said it belonged to our pa, and his pa before him. Told me to wear it and remember that Sullivan men always do what's right, even when it's hard. Emma May leaned closer, seeing the worn edges of the cross, the way Jake's thumb traced its surface like he'd done it 1,000 times before. We were going to be partners, Jake continued. Had it all planned out? Buy a big spread in California, raise the finest horses west of the Mississippi. Thomas was older by 5 years, but he never made me feel like the little brother tagging along, always said we were equals. Spring of 1864. The memory unfolded like Jake was living it again. 2 young men riding hard across Apache territory, their horses' hooves drumming a rhythm of hope and ambition. Thomas rode ahead, his laughter carrying on the wind as he spun tales of their golden future. Just think, Jake, Thomas had called, over his shoulder. Time next year we'll be gentlemen ranchers. Might even find ourselves some pretty California gals to court. Jake had laughed, young and foolish and believing the world was full of nothing but possibilities. Long as my gal can cook better than you, brother. That ain't setting the bar very high, Thomas had shot back, and they'd both laughed until their sides hurt. They'd camped that night in a canyon that seemed safe. High walls, fresh water, good grass for the horses. Thomas took first watch while Jake slept, and Jake woke to his brother shaking his shoulder gently. Your turn, little brother. All quiet. Those were the last words Thomas ever spoke to him. Jake's voice grew distant as he continued. I woke up to war cries and gunfire. Apache war party, maybe 20 strong. They'd been tracking us for days, waiting for the right moment. Emma May's hand found his, her fingers small and warm against his calloused palm. Thomas was trying to get to the horses when they got him. Arrow took him in the chest, and he went down hard. I tried to reach him, but there were too many. Caught a bullet across my ribs that laid me out cold. Jake touched his side, where the scar still pulled tight when it rained. When I came to, it was morning. The Apache were gone. Took our horses and supplies. Thomas was... Jake's voice broke slightly. He was still breathing. Barely. Lasted long enough to press this cross into my hand and make me promise to keep going, to live the life we'd planned, just without him. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of old grief and newer understanding. I buried him there in that canyon, Jake said. Marked the grave with stones and said words over him like our ma would have wanted. Then I walked for 3 days before a cavalry patrol found me. Emma May squeezed his hand. That's when you came. Here? Not right away. Spent a year trying to drink away the guilt, working cattle drives and picking fights with anyone who looked at me sideways. Took me a while to realize Thomas wouldn't want me living like that. Jake looked at her then, really looked at her, and Emma May saw past the quiet exterior to the man beneath. Someone who understood loss and loneliness, who'd built walls around his heart to keep from hurting again. So I came to Cedar Ridge, bought this place and tried to make peace with being alone. Figured it was safer that way. Can't lose what you don't have. But you saved me today, Emma May said. That don't sound like a man playing it safe. Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying their joined hands. When I saw you in that church, looking like you were heading to your own funeral, I heard Thomas's voice clear as day. Sullivan men do what's right even when it's hard. And what's right now? Emma May asked. Jake met her eyes, and for the first time since Thomas died, he allowed himself to hope. Right now? Right now is making sure you get to choose what comes next. No more being sold or traded or forced into anything. You're free, Emma May. Question is, what do you want to do with that freedom? Emma May looked out at the rolling hills, at the cabin Jake had built with his own hands, at the man who'd given her back her life without asking for anything in return. For the first time in years, the future didn't look like a trap. I want to learn, she said. Learn what it feels like to make my own choices. Maybe learn what it feels like to be cared for instead of owned. Jake nodded, understanding passing between them like a shared language. I reckon we both got some learning to do. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, 2 wounded souls sat together on a porch in the middle of nowhere, beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to face the world alone anymore. 3 weeks later, Jake woke to the sound of hoofbeats thundering toward his cabin. He rolled out of bed, grabbed his rifle, and peered through the window into the pre-dawn darkness. 6 riders approached fast, and even in the dim light, he recognized the bulk of Samuel Morrison leading the group. Emma May appeared in the doorway of the spare room where she'd been staying, her hair braided for sleep, eyes wide with fear. Jake? Get. Dressed quick, he said, checking his rifle. Morrison's coming, and he ain't bringing good news. The riders pulled up in front of the cabin with a cloud of dust and the creak of leather. Morrison sat his horse like a judge pronouncing sentence, flanked by 5 men Jake recognized as hired guns from the saloon, the kind of men who'd do anything for the right price. Sullivan! Morrison's voice boomed across the yard. Send out my bride. We got business to finish. Jake stepped onto the porch, rifle held loose but ready. She ain't your bride, Morrison. We settled this weeks ago. You settled nothing but stealing another man's property. Morrison spat tobacco juice into the dirt. That girl was bought and paid for, and I aim to collect what's mine. The only thing that's yours is the horse you're sitting on, Jake replied, his voice steady as stone. Emma May's free to make her own choices. Free? Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. Girl like that ain't meant to be free. She's meant to serve a man who can provide for her. You think you can take care of her on this 2-bit spread? Emma May stepped onto the porch beside Jake, her chin raised despite the tremor in her hands. I can take care of myself, Mr. Morrison. Morrison's eyes went cold as Winter Creek water. Can you now? What happens when Sullivan here gets tired of playing rescuer? Where you gonna go then, girl? Who's gonna want damaged goods? Jake's grip tightened on his rifle. Watch your mouth, Morrison. Or what? You gonna shoot me? Murder a respected citizen over some orphan girl nobody wants? The words hit their mark. Emma May flinched, and Jake saw the old fears creeping back into her eyes. The belief that she was worthless, unwanted, a burden on anyone who tried to help her. That's enough, Jake said, stepping forward. But Morrison wasn't finished. Tell you what, Sullivan, I'm a reasonable man. You give me the girl and I'll forget about the money you cost me. Hell, I'll even throw in $50 for your trouble. No deal. Morrison's face darkened. Then maybe it's time folks in Cedar Ridge learned the truth about their quiet hero. Boys? One of the hired guns, a thin man with dead eyes, spoke up. We've been asking around about you, Sullivan. Interesting things we learned about that brother of yours. Jake's blood turned to ice water. Leave Thomas out of this. Thomas Sullivan, the gunman continued, enjoying the effect his words were having. Wanted for robbery in 3 states. Amazing what you can learn when you know the right people to ask. That's a lie, Jake said, but his voice cracked slightly. Morrison leaned forward in his saddle. Is it? Maybe your brother wasn't the golden boy you remember. Maybe that Apache attack wasn't as random as you thought. Maybe they were tracking a couple of thieves who'd robbed the wrong people. Emma May looked at Jake, confusion and worry in her blue eyes. Jake? The truth hit Jake like a physical blow. Memories he'd buried came rushing back. Thomas's secretive behavior in the weeks before they left, the expensive gear he'd bought with money he claimed came from poker winnings, the way he'd insisted they take that particular route through Apache territory. Even if it was true, Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. It don't change nothing, doesn't it? Morrison smiled like a snake. Think about it, girl. Your hero there might be harboring a fugitive's stolen money. That cabin, this land, might all be bought with blood money. Emma May's world tilted. Everything she'd believed about Jake, about her rescue, about finding someone good in a world full of Morrisons. Was it all built on a lie? Jake saw the doubt in her eyes and felt his heart break all over again. Just like 15 years ago, everything he cared about was being torn away. Emma May, he said softly. Whatever Thomas might have done, whatever money he might have had, I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know. But the damage was done. Morrison had planted his poison, and Jake could see it spreading through Emma May's mind like ink through water. Time's up, Sullivan, Morrison said. Girl comes with me now, or I ride to town and tell everyone about the thief's brother living among them. How long you think before they come for you with a rope? Jake looked at Emma May, saw the fear and confusion warring in her face, and made the hardest decision of his life. The same decision he'd been making for 15 years, to protect others by stepping away. Go, he said quietly. What? Emma May stared at him. Go with him, Jake said, his voice hollow as an empty grave. Maybe you'll be safer. Emma May felt like she'd been slapped. Jake, no, I don't care what they're saying about. It don't matter what you care about, Jake interrupted, the lies coming easier than he'd expected. Morrison's right. I can't take care of you proper. This ain't no place for a young woman. He turned and walked back into the cabin, leaving Emma May standing on the porch with her world crumbling around her. Through the window he watched Morrison help her onto a horse, watched the riders disappear into the morning mist, and felt the last piece of his heart turn to dust. For the second time in his life, Jake Sullivan had lost everything that mattered. And just like before, he blamed himself for caring in the first place. 2 days after Morrison took Emma May, Jake hadn't eaten, hadn't slept, and had nearly worn a groove in his cabin floor from pacing. The silence that had once been his companion now felt like a prison. Every corner of the small space held memories of her, the way she hummed while making coffee, the sound of her reading aloud from the newspaper, the sight of her mending his shirts with careful, precise stitches. On the third morning, as Jake sat on his porch staring at nothing, he heard a horse approaching. His hand moved instinctively to his gun, but he recognized the rider, Doc Henderson from town, with his black bag and worried expression. Jake, Doc called as he dismounted. "We need to talk." "Ain't in a talking mood, Doc." Doc Henderson tied his horse and approached the porch. He was a small man with gray whiskers and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering. "It's about Emma May." Jake's head snapped up. "What about her?" "Morrison brought her to me yesterday evening. Said she'd taken a fall from her horse." Doc's voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes were angry. "Funny thing about falls, Jake. They don't usually leave finger-shaped bruises on a woman's arms." Jake was on his feet in an instant. "He hurt her?" "She wouldn't say much, but I've been doctoring folks for 30 years. I know the difference between accident and intent." Doc sat heavily in the chair Emma May used to favor. "She kept asking about you, though. Wanted to know if you were all right, if Morrison had hurt you when they took her." Jake felt something crack inside his chest. "She shouldn't be worrying about me, shouldn't she? Boy asked me to tell you something in case I saw you." Doc reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "She wrote this when Morrison wasn't looking." Jake's hands shook as he unfolded the paper. Emma May's careful handwriting filled half the page. "Jake, I don't care what they said about your brother. I don't care if every word was true. You saved me when no one else would. You gave me kindness when the world gave me cruelty. That's who you are, not what someone else might have done. I chose you then, and I choose you now. If you'll have me back, I'll be waiting. If not, I'll understand. But I needed you to know. You're the best man I've ever known." Emma May Jake read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. She'd chosen him. Even knowing what Morrison had said about Thomas, even facing the possibility that everything Jake owned might be stolen, she'd chosen him. "Doc," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion, "how bad did he hurt her?" "Bad enough. Bruises mostly, but Jake, a man who'll hit a woman once will do it again. And Morrison's got mean in him that runs bone deep." Jake folded the letter carefully and put it in his shirt pocket close to his heart. "Where is she now?" "Morrison's ranch. Got her locked up in the house, telling folks she's sick and can't have visitors." Doc stood up, his old bones creaking. "Jake, I've known you for years. You're a good man, and whatever your brother might have done, don't change that. But if you're gonna act, you better act soon. Morrison's talking about taking her to Denver, says the mountain air will help her health." After Doc left, Jake sat alone with his thoughts and Emma May's letter. For the first time in 15 years, he let himself really think about Thomas. Not the idealized memory he'd carried, but the real man his brother had been. Thomas had always been charming, always had money when they needed it, always seemed to know which towns to avoid and which roads were safe. Jake had been 19 and trusting, believing his big brother's explanations without question. Maybe Morrison was right. Maybe Thomas had been running from something, and maybe that Apache attack hadn't been random. But as Jake sat there, another memory surfaced, Thomas on his deathbed pressing the silver cross into Jake's palm. "Jake," Thomas had whispered, his voice barely audible. "I ain't been the man Pa raised me to be. Made mistakes, hurt people. But you got goodness in you I never had. Promise me you'll be better than I was." Those weren't the words of a man proud of his choices. They were the words of someone seeking redemption through his brother's future. Jake stood up and walked to the small wooden box where he kept his important papers. Underneath the deed to his property and his discharge papers from a cattle drive, he found what he was looking for: a letter from a bank in Kansas, dated 2 years after Thomas died. He'd never opened it, assuming it was just business correspondence that had followed him from town to town. Now, with shaking hands, he broke the seal and read, "Mr. Jacob Sullivan, we regret to inform you of the death of your brother, Thomas Sullivan. As per his instructions, the sum of $200 held in trust for you is now available for withdrawal. Mr. Sullivan was most specific that this money came from legitimate cattle sales and was meant to help you start fresh. Our condolences for your loss." Jake stared at the letter until the words blurred. Thomas had left him money. Clean money from honest work. Whatever else his brother might have done, he'd tried to make things right at the end, but it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was Emma May, locked up in Morrison's house, believing Jake had abandoned her again. Jake strapped on his gun belt for the first time in 3 weeks and saddled midnight. As he rode toward Morrison's ranch, Emma May's letter crinkled against his chest with each of the horse's strides, reminding him of her words. "You're the best man I've ever known." Maybe it was time he started believing that himself. The sun was setting by the time Jake reached the ridge overlooking Morrison's spread. The big house sat in the valley below, surrounded by barns and bunkhouses, smoke rising from the chimney into the darkening sky. Somewhere in that house was the woman who'd chosen him despite everything, who believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. Jake touched his brother's cross one more time, said a prayer for courage, and urged midnight down the hill. It was time to finish what he'd started in that church 3 weeks ago. Resolution: 800 to 1,000 words. Jake left midnight tied in a grove of cottonwoods half a mile from Morrison's house and approached on foot as the moon rose full and bright. The ranch was quiet except for the occasional lowing of cattle and the distant sound of men talking in the bunkhouse. He circled the main house, studying the windows until he found what he was looking for: a soft glow from an upstairs room and a shadow moving behind the curtains. Emma May. The old oak tree beside the house had branches that reached almost to the second-story window. Jake had climbed plenty of trees as a boy, and some skills never left a man. He made it to the right branch without a sound, and tapped gently on the glass. The curtain moved, and Emma May's face appeared. Her eyes went wide when she saw him, and she quickly opened the window. "Jake," she whispered, reaching out to touch his face like she needed to make sure he was real. "You came." "Course I came." Jake climbed through the window and gathered her into his arms, feeling the tension leave his body for the first time in days. "You all right?" "Doc said Morrison hurt you." Emma May pressed her face against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and honest work. "Just bruises. I'm fine now that you're here." Jake pulled back to look at her in the moonlight. There was a purple mark along her jaw and finger-shaped bruises on her wrists, but her eyes were clear and determined. "Emma May, about what Morrison said about Thomas." "I don't care," she interrupted. "I meant what I wrote in that letter. I know who you are, Jake Sullivan. You're the man who saved me when no one else would. You're the man who gave me $40 and asked for nothing in return. That's all I need to know." Jake kissed her then, soft and gentle, pouring 15 years of loneliness and 3 days of fear into that simple touch. When they broke apart, Emma May smiled for the first time since Morrison had taken her. "We need to go," Jake said. "I got midnight waiting in the trees." "Wait." Emma May moved to the dresser and picked up a small bundle. "My mother's Bible and the dress Mrs. Henderson gave me. Everything else belongs to Morrison anyway." They were halfway to the window when the door burst open. Morrison stood in the doorway with a shotgun in his hands and murder in his eyes. "Well, well," Morrison said. "The thief's brother comes calling." Jake stepped in front of Emma May, his hand moving to his gun. "Let her go, Morrison. This is between you and me now." "Nothing's between us, Sullivan. You're nothing. A nobody living on stolen money, thinking you can play hero." Morrison raised the shotgun. "Girl belongs to me, legal and proper." "Legal don't make it right," Jake said. "And she don't belong to anybody but herself." Morrison's finger tightened on the trigger, but Emma May stepped out from behind Jake. "You want me so bad, Mr. Morrison?" she said, her voice steady as bedrock. "Then you can have me, but you'll never have all of me. Part of my heart will always belong to the man who taught me I was worth saving." "Shut up, girl." "No," Emma May said, and Jake had never heard such strength in her voice. "I won't shut up anymore. You can force me to cook your meals and clean your house, but you can't force me to respect you. You can't force me to care for you, and you sure can't force me to love you." Morrison's face went red with rage. "I'll teach you respect." "You'll teach her nothing," Jake said, drawing his gun in one smooth motion. "Because she's leaving with me." For a moment, the three of them stood frozen in tableau. Morrison with his shotgun, Jake with his pistol, Emma May between them like the prize in some deadly game. Then Morrison made his choice. He swung the shotgun toward Emma May, and Jake did what any decent man would do. He put himself between the woman he loved and the man who would hurt her. The shotgun boomed in the small room. but Jake's pistol spoke first. Morrison staggered backward, clutching his shoulder, his weapon clattering to the floor. "Next one won't be in the shoulder," Jake said, his gun steady on Morrison's chest. "MMA, get the rope from that chair." With Morrison tied up and cursing, Jake helped MMA out the window and down the tree. They ran through the moonlight to where Midnight waited, and Jake lifted her onto the horse before swinging up behind her. "Where are we going?" MMA asked as they rode hard away from the ranch. "Preacher Williams owes me a favor," Jake said, his arms secure around her waist. "And I figure it's about time you got to choose your own wedding." 3 hours later, as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Jake and MMA stood in the little church in Cedar Ridge. This time, MMA wore her simple blue dress instead of white, and her smile outshone the morning light. "Do you, Jacob Sullivan, take MMA to be your wife, to love and protect her all the days of your life?" Jake looked into her blue eyes and saw his future, not the lonely existence he'd planned, but something rich and full of possibilities. "I do." "And do you, MMA, take Jacob to be your husband, to stand by him through whatever comes?" MMA thought of the quiet cowboy who'd saved her twice now, who'd shown her that love meant choice, not ownership. "I do." When they kissed as husband and wife, Jake felt Thomas's presence like a blessing, and he knew his brother would approve of the man he'd finally become. 6 months later, Jake and MMA stood on their porch watching the sunset paint their valley in gold. MMA's hand rested on her growing belly, and Jake's arms were wrapped around them both. "You ever regret it?" Jake asked. "Choosing a quiet cowboy over a rich rancher?" MMA leaned back against his chest and smiled. "Never. Rich can't buy what we got, Jake Sullivan." "And what's that?" "Choice," she said simply. "The choice to love and be loved back." 5 years later, visitors to Cedar Ridge might notice a well-kept ranch on the hill outside town. They'd see a quiet cowboy working his land with strong, gentle hands, and a woman with auburn hair hanging laundry while 2 small children played at her feet. If they asked the folks in town about Jake and MMA Sullivan, they'd hear a story about love conquering fear, about a man who learned that silence ain't always strength, and about a woman who discovered her own worth was never up for sale. The old-timers might tell you that Jake still wears his brother's silver cross, but now, it catches the light when he smiles, which he does often these days. They'd tell you that MMA runs the best little school Cedar Ridge ever had, teaching children that they all have choices to make and dreams to follow. And if you listened real close to the wind blowing through that valley, you might hear an echo of the truth that changed 2 lives forever. Sometimes the strongest ones are the quietest, until they find someone worth speaking up for. Sometimes love ain't about owning, it's about setting free. And sometimes, when a quiet cowboy finds his voice, the whole world changes.